for Advanced American Studies. We're a newly established center and operate as part of the Institute of International Studies at MGIMO University. Our research focuses on domestic and foreign policy of the United States, as well as America's relations with Russia, China, and the rest of the world. My name is Maxim Sushkov. I'm director of the center, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's event, for which we have two fantastic speakers who have authored a really great book. Dr. Alexandra Kuli, director of the Harriman Institute and professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University, and Dr. Дэниэля Нексона, who is a professor of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Both gentlemen, we're thankful so much for your time and willingness to talk about your book. They're prolific authors and writers, great professionals, and I encourage everyone who's following, American foreign policy and U.S.-Russia relations to, and generally the field of IR, to read their other books. They're as great. And we have our dear colleague, associate professor of the Department of Applied Analysis, Dr. Igor Istomin, who is in sabbatical this year at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. In the book that we're going to talk about today, and this is the first, as I mentioned, in our series, Alexandra Kuli and Дэниэля Нексона really have touched, I think, upon a very important topic in today's IR, and talking today about the way that American leadership or dominance, I'll let the authors talk about this, evolved in the post-Cold War era. And they're making some very strong arguments, and we'll look forward to their presentation. But in the exit from Hegemony, the authors, in my view, most importantly, developed a new integrated approach to understanding the rise and decline of hegemonic orders in general. And their approach identifies three distinct ways in which the liberal international order is undergoing fundamental transformation. And I'll let the authors expand on those issues. I'll just mention that we will proceed as follows, that first, both of our speakers will deliver their remarks. Then our colleague, Dr. Igor Istomin, the discussant of today's event, will have a few things to say about the book and probably the overall issue. Then we'll ask the speakers to respond to Professor Istomin's comments. And after that, I will read the questions we received from you off the screen. So therefore, please feel free to forward your questions to the chat box, and we'll do our best to tackle as many of them, if not all of them, as possible. So if you worry that your mom or some of your friends may be missing out on this event, well, they are. But since we care about our audience, we'll also be recording this event and uploading the video to our YouTube channel in coming days. I will share most additional details of this event in the chat box so that everyone can see them. This event will be in English and will last for about an hour and a half. So make yourself comfortable, and we hope you enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed preparing for it. So gentlemen, with no further ado, let's turn the floor over to you.
So Alex, do you want to say some words in introduction while I deal with the fact that my computer has wigged out, which of course happens. Okay, there we go. I should be able to get this up and running in a second. For some reason. Okay, all right. So what I'm going to need people to do is I'm going to start the screen share, and I'm going to need you to tell me whether or not things look the way that they. Why am I? Okay, I want desktop 3. Okay, whether or not what you see is in a second is in fact a slideshow presentation and it looks normal to you, because I can't always tell from where I'm standing. Okay, so do you see a slide, exit from Hegemony? Nothing else on the screen?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for having us. We're going to talk today about our book, and specifically, we're sort of going to frame our discussion around the question of why we think that Biden can't prevent the continued erosion of US hegemony. He might be able to adopt policies that slow the decline or that make a smoother, that allow for a smoother landing. But as far as we argue, people who think that sort of the Trump administration uniquely drove U.S. hegemonic unraveling, et cetera, are wrong. So so let me give you the outline. We're going to start by talking about the argument. And we're going to talk about our theory of the processes of hegemonic unraveling and what the sort of main punchlines of the book are. In particular, we're going to talk about why this time it's real, that despite multiple times before when people have anticipated or predicted US decline, it seems like the US has been declining since 1945, according to some people, that this time it's actually happening. We're going to run through then the processes and mechanisms that we associate with hegemonic unraveling. That is the erosion of the hegemonic order, which in turn erodes the hegemonic position of the United States or of any dominant power. And then we're going to go into some contemporary examples. We're going to talk about specific ways in which we're seeing the mechanisms and processes that we talk about play out right now. And then time allowing, we'll discuss some implications. We'll come back to this question about what this means for the foreign policy of the new administration. So the argument. Our argument is our bottom line argument is pretty straightforward. US global hegemony is over. And by this, we mean global hegemony. The United States is likely to remain, if not the most powerful country in the world, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful countries in the world. But the kind of global reach, the kind of colossus astride the globe position that it enjoyed in the 1990s and early 2000s is gone. It's not also that it's not coming back. We could caveat that there were massive economic shocks that disrupted or collapsed peer competitors might make it come back, but really, absent those, it's done. Stick a fork in it. There is no Biden restoration in the offing. We provide 3 exits. It's the book's called Exit from Hegemony. Our publisher wanted to use that, so we have what we call 3 exits, 3 processes of exit. The first is what we call exit from above, and this is in the form of great power challenges and great power challengers. We have exit from below, which is essentially weaker states leveraging greater exit options that are now afforded to them in international politics and that are generally afforded to weaker political communities during similar power transitions. And then exit from within, where we focus on counter-order movements, and particularly transnationally linked counter-order movements, that is political movements often within the core itself, the core of the hegemonic order, who want to revise or change that order and ultimately are undermined, in doing so, undermine the power position of the hegemon. Now, one of our key arguments is that we don't need a hegemonic war. A lot of the literature on power transitions and changes in international order takes as focal point that the decline of the dominant actor of the leading state and the rise of a challenger can result in this great conflagration, a great showdown, a system-wide war. This is, of course, a callback to the so-called Thucydides trap, to Athens versus Sparta, or Spain versus France, or the UK versus Germany, earlier the UK versus France, the First World War, the Second World War. All of these are supposed to be power transition wars that in their wake opened up a new order. But we don't think you need that. We think that you can get, and are getting right now, massive transformations in international order, changes in international order without any great power conflict. And we actually are a little skeptical of the whole Thucydides trap frame. We're happy to talk about why in the Q&A. Okay, so why is it this time real? I mean, really, when you look at, as I said, post-1945 period, the moment the United States is a globally dominant actor, everybody's predicting its decline. We've been through this in the 60s, we've been through this in the 70s, we went through in the 80s. So why now? Why do we think this is correct? Why do we think that it is really happening, or it has really happened? To understand why, let's talk a little bit about the unipolar moment. Remember that in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States was seen as having this unprecedented position of being the only great power, the only superpower globally. And by the late 1990s, you had American foreign policy thinkers and speakers and officials talking about how the United States was the indispensable nation, making a standard argument about hegemony. Unless the dominant power of the United States was on board, nothing would really happen, and that the United States was in a particular position because of its great unipolar capacity to engage in the kinds of ordering policies that nobody else could. Now, what's interesting about this is that, as I mentioned, this is a major turnaround from the way that discourses looked as late as 87, 88, right? So if you go back to the 80s, this is a period in which everybody is predicting U.S. decline. We've just had the Bretton Woods system collapse and have to be reconstituted, and people like Robert Cohen were writing books about how it wasn't really such a big deal that hegemony was over because we could still have international cooperation. Paul Kennedy was talking about how the United States was headed on the same route as all these great powers before it, unless it successfully righted its domestic political economy, unless it got additional burden sharing, it would wind up being another falling great power. Because predictions indicated that Japan would overtake the US economically, you had people, I took a course with Ezra Vogel in college, arguing that the United States needed to imitate Japanese management and national industrial practices if it wanted to remain competitive. And you had an increasing number of writers in the United States and in Japan talking about essentially a power transition conflict with Japan, and Japan finally asserting itself, and the United States, well, the United States pressured Japan to, to allow U.S. goods in, and had increasing policy conflicts with Japan. In fact, in essence, in the 1980s, the U.S. looked like toast. Indeed, one of the two or three most important books about hegemonic wars and power transitions. This is Robert Gilpin's War and Change International Politics, published in the early 1980s, assumed that the Soviet Union was a successful challenger. It argued that the Soviet Union had arrived, it was stable, the United States now had to deal with it, and the United States was in real trouble because of its fiscal imbalances. It could not sustain guns and butter spending. So this was the kind of outlook of the book that is one of the key reference points for all discussions since on hegemonic stability and hegemonic order theory. So our argument now is that the entrance, the way that what actually happened to produce the unipolar moment, helps us to understand what led to the entrance of U.S. global hegemony, helps us to understand what's happening now and what the exit looks like. So if you go back to the early 1990s, mid-1990s, there are a couple of things that happen. The first is that the predictions, the straight line predictions, the projections of Japanese and US growth turn out to be wrong. Japan has its asset bubble burst, demographic problems, and it goes into the so-called lost decade. Meanwhile, the United States experiences an unexpected productivity boom centered around the tech sector and personal computing, and the blue line, that's Japan, never does catch up by the early 2000s. The United States actually increases the gap with Japan. Moreover, of course, in 1986, 1987, the Cold War comes winding down. I say 86, 87 because, as far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union is a separate event. The Cold War ends, I think, with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and Reagan and Gorbachev deciding that they want to move towards a cooperative shift. This, for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure you all know about and can probably talk about more authoritatively than I can, Gorbachev winds up giving up the so-called Outer Empire, allowing the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Warsaw Pact communist regimes. Then, of course, the nationalist uprisings there rebound back into the Soviet Union itself, and you get a series of nationalist secessions, which help to, or desired national secessions in the Baltic states, etc., that in coalition with Yeltsin helped to bring down the Soviet Union entirely. This, of course, leaves the United States suddenly alone at the top if you look at indicators like military spending. So what's interesting, of course, about the 1990s is that in real terms, US military spending declines until the early 2000s, until the Bush administration and the Iraq War. The United States is realizing something of a peace dividend, as they say, but what actually happens is the disappearance of the Soviet Union just means the US does not have a military peer competitor. I thought there was going to be another slide there. And of course, if you look at GDP trends, which I've already suggested, the United States now has unprecedented economic power. Sometimes when we give this talk, when we do it in the United States, we sort of explain what's going on to people who don't maybe know the IR or know the history by talking about using what we call the Walmart analogy. So if you have any knowledge of the United States in the 1990s, this is the era of the explosive growth of Walmart, where Walmart is moving in across small town America and setting up shop. And when Walmart moved across small town America, it tended to drive out businesses on Main Street. Right, so Walmart was associated with the collapse of a lot of smaller retail outlets. And why was it doing so? Well, Walmart was able to offer at better prices and oftentimes at better quality a whole set of goods that people would have normally purchased elsewhere. So by the time this process was happening, people were purchasing. By the time Walmart was a place where you bought food. In the 1990s, it was a place where you bought your guns. And so it was a place where you bought toys, where you bought consumer goods, it had a pharmacy. And so Walmart became effectively, de facto, nearly the only game in town for the purchase of a lot of consumer goods. And indeed, there was all this talk in the 1990s about how Walmart was the way of the future. Look at the success of Walmart. Maybe other businesses ought to model on Walmart, or we ought to, we need to deal now with the fact that Walmart is the most successful and the new way of doing retail in the United States. Now, if you know all that, right, you kind of know the story about the collapse of Main Street, the collapse of malls, the rise of the Walmart box store. But if we sort of think about a kind of even broader version of that, we can kind of get a handle on what's going on internationally. So imagine that an outlet like Walmart didn't just provide all of these consumer goods, it was also the only bank in town. It was where you went to do your banking needs. Imagine also that instead of just coming in and seeing greeters, that it sent greeters all over the neighborhoods, all over the town, explaining how awesome Walmart was and teaching you how to shop at Walmart and to be like Walmart. And such that Walmart not only exercised monopoly power when it came to consumer goods, but it also had a kind of ideological power over that town. Well, that's what we argue, what we explain to people is essentially the position the United States was in the 1990s. With the collapse of a rival alternative order, there was no other game in town. It was just the United States and other Western donors. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was also no military competitor. And because the collapse was in fact the collapse of entire order, there was no other ideological game in town. Everybody kind of, if you looked at a great power as the potential model, it was the United States and it was no one else. Moreover, the United States was sending out NGOs, transnational actors, civil society actors, was building an international civil society premised on the idea that liberal democracy was the wave of the future and was the only way to go, and teaching, teaching the former communist nations and teaching other states supposedly how to do elections, how to have a free press, how to do civil disobedience and all that kind of stuff. So in essence, what you had was you had this economic position in the 1990s. You still had the U.S. and its allies, the G7 states, controlling a clear plurality of U.S. gross domestic product. That goes lower. You, of course, have the Chinese economy overtaking that of the United States in PPP terms. And you have, indeed, what's interesting is that the forecasts indicate either on nominal terms that there'll remain a gap, but that the EU will be into China, or even that China will overtake the United States. And the point here is that regardless of whether or not China actually overtakes the United States in nominal terms, or whether China is able to keep its PPP economy above that of the United States, it's still rivalrous in a way that economy hasn't been for a long time. So what did that mean? So what does that process teach us, and what does that change teach us? Well, first of all, so you had in the 1990s, you developed what we call an American and Western patronage monopoly, like Walmart and small town America, for development assistance and all that other stuff. The US was the only game in town. You had also text that's not appearing, but you should also have a lack of an alternative model. And then you had these processes I talked about, transnational civil society, all pushing, expanding what we sometimes call the liberal order, what we call American-led hegemonic ordering. what happens by the late 1990s, early 2000s is you start to get inoculation strategies. That is, states that hadn't been completely integrated into this order began to figure out ways of interdicting, say, US NGOs. And Alex will talk a little bit more about that, and started to figure out ways of pushing back when they didn't want to take certain aspects of that order. And from that pushback started in these other trends, these power transition trends, you start to get a reversal. So you have now the emergence of multiple patrons. You have alternative order building, the creation of alternative orders, and you have reactionary populism and other transnational movements that have put the foot, sort of the energy on the other foot. Instead of liberal transnational civil society being on the upswing, you have, in fact, a transnational reactionary and left-wing populists on the upswing, pushing back against liberal ordering. So we actually have a kind of more analytical story about this, and the way you can think about it is as follows. Hegemonic ordering works through the provision of private and public goods. And in the US hegemonic system, there are really three main goods that the US uses. Economic aid and development assistance, security provision, whether directly through security guarantees or through, say, things like arms sales, and then open markets, particularly in the 1990s, early 2000s, access to the US market was incredibly important and was an effective tool, and now access to, say, the US financial system and not having to deal with, say, US sanctions. Now, these tools, the provision of these goods is what allows states to do ordering, because first, the conditions attached to these goods are primarily how you get changes in domestic and foreign policy that are along the lines of the hegemon's preferred policies. So using carrots of stick, so for example, the goods provision exclusion aren't just carrots and sticks for conditionality, by which powers shape order, which is how we think about it. And of course, in the 1990s and early 2000s, we see this effect where aid conditionality starts to work because the US has this monopoly. But they also, our claim is that the provision of goods are the constituent elements of order. How states provide goods multilaterally in more liberal terms, in more transparent or more corrupt terms, more in the form of private goods versus club goods versus public goods, that this is in fact the texture of international order. And so hegemon not only uses conditionality to enforce its ordering preferences, but the way that it gives goods shapes the hegemonic order. And as I've suggested before, what makes the hegemony possible is this quasi-monopoly on the provision of club and private goods, and also in theory public goods, but there are no pure public goods, so they're all kind of club goods. So during power transitions, as we've already suggested, based on the kind of brief historical kind of outline, the hegemon loses its patronage monopoly. You start to have other states that are capable of giving security guarantees that are valuable, of providing other forms of security assistance that are at least are competitive potentially with the hegemon. You also get the provision of development assistance and market access and trade relations in ways that are actually pretty good quality or potentially substitutable goods. And this has a number of effects. On the supply side, this means that you suddenly have the ability of exit options from the hegemonic order, from processes of hegemonic ordering. So it is now possible to go to, if this were Walmart, you now have Amazon in town, right? You have Target, you have other competitors who can provide alternatives. The growth of these supply side effects has demand side effects. So one of them is that governance, who previously might have been like, well, basically, it's the only game in town, I guess we're going to go along with it, or we'll at least pretend to go along with it because we don't really know what the alternatives are, that they suddenly become interested in the fact that they have these new bargains available. So they can start thinking about alternative ways of doing politics, of doing international politics, and not just sort of small regional alternatives that tend to sputter out, but actually, more robust bargains that can really substitute over the long haul. You also get new models for success, right? The rising powers themselves can serve as ways, as means domestically, internationally, in terms of their foreign policies, their economic policies, their domestic political institutions, can start to hold up as new models, right? So you can start having an imagination about alternative ways you could do things. This not only gives more governments per se more interest in new bargains and new arrangements, but it also helps to push and develop counter order movements, because you also have political movements during power, all times, who are dissatisfied with elements of international order and with their political system. But now they can start looking internationally and start thinking about, hey, we could become a different, if we came to power, we could become somebody else's client, or we could do things the way that the Chinese are doing things, or the way that the Russians are doing things. And that's actually pretty viable. Look, it's working pretty well. It satisfies some of our core concerns. And that not only orients counter-order movements towards common kinds of purposes, but it also gives impetus to counter-order movements. And so not only do governments, incumbent governments, become interested in new bargains, but counter-order movements at times take over governments. They win elections, they come to power. And even if they don't do so, they're capable of pressuring or shaping policy within existing governments as they become more and more viable. This increases three kind of dynamics that are what then themselves produce hegemonic order unraveling. So it increases the leverage of weaker powers. It leads to increased order contestation, and it allows for alternative order building, roughly parallel with these three effects. Now, both of these things, the leverage of weaker powers and alternative order building, themselves then increase order contestation and help to unravel hegemonic ordering and therefore the position of the hegemon. We have these logics of contestation. I think we're taking a long time, so I'm just going to blow through these really quickly. We talk about how there are two main ways that power politics work, and that opposition to order or maintenance of order work. One of which is we call wedging, which is simply what you think of as divide and rule and divide and conquer strategies. That is that if you are a rising power emerging in a crowded ecosystem with a hegemon, the only way that you can kind of build your own order or your own set of alliances is to actually try to disrupt or break up existing alliances, or to break up existing abilities of states to mobilize the way that they've been doing in ways that exclude you or weaken you. And so wedging strategies are just whatever strategies using carrots and sticks that you have to try to break up existing coalitions. And it's a key strategy for rising powers, as I've suggested, because they face a crowded ecosystem. Brokerage is just the opposite. Brokerage is creating ties. And the important thing about brokerage is that the construction of alternative orders, the real kind of alternative order and counter order building is actually in practice is the same thing as building ties, right? So it's about creating new ties between rising powers and existing in other states that either are under provisioned by the current hegemonic order and therefore are looking for alternatives, or in conjunction with successful wedging become available as potential partners. And this has all sorts of effects. Not only does it help rising powers challenge the order, but it also means that weaker states gain leverage and autonomy. Because they now have exit options, they can threaten exit, or they can diversify their portfolios, which means they have more influence. They can push back against hegemonic ordering pressures. And we have a 2x2, which we can come back to, about the ways that these wedging and brokering strategies intersect with alternative order building and order contestation. But I think you can see that really graphically as Alex talks about how this is playing out right now. So Alex?
Yeah, thanks very much. So let's look at some contemporary examples of these kinds of contestations. And let's start with great power order contestation. And some of these will be familiar to you. We see both attempts to create new fabrics as well as disrupt old fabrics. So the Belt and Road, I think, is a very good example of a type of new or ordering strategy that has elements of both, right? So despite sort of Chinese official proclamations that this is just about investment, there are many ordering dimensions of the Belt and Road, whether it is locking in states into bilateral economic relationships, increasing debt loads, making them go up to Chinese regulatory and technological standards, especially in the area of telecommunications or surveillance technologies. There are multiple ordering effects. At the same time, membership in the Belt and Road also has disrupted the unity of existing coalitions. So one example here that we talk about is that of Greece in June 2017. For the first time, Greece vetoed an EU statement, an annual statement that criticized China's human rights practices. The Greek foreign minister said this was not helpful, and that was, of course, the year in which the agreement on Piraeus as being one of the gateways to the BRI was signed. At the same time, we see some brokerage too. We see both China and Russia, we would include here, creating new types of counter-ordering institutions, whether it's in the economic sphere, such as the Eurasian Economic Union or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or in the security sphere, something like the CSTO. And one of the points we make in the book is that areas Central Asia and Southeast Asia account for the majority, plurality, but also majority in some cases, of these new organizations, right? So we can talk about neighborhood effects here too, that these are the two regions in which there's a much denser set of ordering mechanisms because of these Chinese and Russian initiatives. At the same time, there are now increasing modes of leverage to challenge existing norms. So this is a map of the Human Rights Council and their reaction to the Xinjiang re-education camps. In green are the countries that initially signed a letter of criticism and condemnation of China. And these are the 21 countries, core countries associated with the liberal order. The US had withdrawn back then, so it wasn't there, but it's Canada, it's Australia, Japan, New Zealand, it's Western Europe and the Scandinavian countries and the UK. Well, a few weeks later, as you know, China mobilizes a counter letter of 37 countries that will then go to over 50 countries that not only supports Chinese policies in Xinjiang, but praises China for being the keeper of UN human rights norms, right? Upholding UN human rights norms. And this is a map, some might see it of the post-Western world, but certainly a map of those countries contesting these classical liberal human rights norms, and they cover Eurasia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Let's go to the next slide. At the same time, we have the bottom-up dynamics. One of the points we make in this book is that we have the rise of populism, and populist leaders actually generates a kind of a distinct phenomena that we refer to multipolar populism. So one of the defining features of leaders like Erdogan or Viktor Orban in Hungary or Duterte here in the Philippines, these are all leaders of countries that have traditionally been in the US security architecture, whether as members of NATO or bilaterally in the Asian Pacific. But as part of their domestic political posturing, all of them are emphasizing that they are not going to be bound by having to play by Western norms and just being associated with the US, that they are actively seeking economic and security engagement with Russia and China, right? And in fact, Duterte does a 180 in terms of South China Sea proclamations to court Chinese investment, but here he is also with President Putin. And of course, you know the story about Erdogan and you know the story about Orban too. So the multipolar populace. At the same time, what's really interesting about this who gives the most aid to Serbia graphic, sometimes it's not even actual goods provision, as Dan has been talking about. There's a perception that alternative powers are doing more than the hegemon. And it's just a perception. So this was a very interesting survey conducted by Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in the fall of 2019 in Serbia, asking Serbian citizens who gives the most aid to Serbia. On the left, you'll see that 40% answered China, right? Just 18% answered the EU, 15% answered Russia. Who actually gives Serbia the most aid? Overwhelmingly, the European Union, overwhelmingly, right? China's not even in the picture here when you account for it. Yet there is this perception that China has become a rising collective goods provider, in part because some of the high profile Belt and Road projects, including a high-speed rail link. We understand the Ukraine conflict. We can understand the Ukraine conflict in many ways, but as a battle between who gets to provide collective goods over Ukraine in the Eurasian sphere. Perhaps it was a battle that the EU walked into unwittingly, but nevertheless, when we look at what was at stake with Mr. Yanukovych in the partnership association agreements, this is the contestation of who gets to provide goods in Ukraine as a matter of right. So we can understand the Ukrainian conflict not only about Ukraine, but as a conflict about shifts in this order contestation. Next one, Dan. Okay, we're going to now start the sort of contestation from within. So one of the defining features, especially over the last 10 years, is that we increasingly see that there are divisions within the West itself, within the liberal order, between promoting liberal internationalism, the way it's been traditionally understood, and contesting it, right? Open illiberalism. One of the striking features of this Pew Center poll that came out that saw most negative perceptions of the US was that a small part a small part of respondents saw an increase in support of President Trump, and that was overwhelmingly among self-identified European right-wing populist party supporters. And what we saw, in fact, in the Trump administration, the executive, was the appointment of ambassadors throughout Europe, of ambassadors with quite illiberal views. Whether it's the Dutch ambassador, who actively becomes involved in Dutch domestic politics, and in fact holds a fundraiser for a Dutch far-right party, whether it's, of course, Russia being involved in creating links with parties both on the European left and the European right that are anti-systemic in the sense that they oppose these countries' membership of transatlantic institutions, whether it's the EU or NATO. Next one. And overall, what we also have is this new kind of brokering phenomenon too. So this is, once again, our friend Prime Minister Viktor Orban in Hungary, and here he is delivering the keynote to the World Congress of Family. And for us, this is a quintessential new counter-ordering institution. Initially started in the 1990s by two Christian right organizations right here in the US, that then starts to network prominently in Eurasia, also with some Russian and Eurasian groups, and now holds summits throughout the region. And in fact, the last summit it did was in Verona, to advance an agenda that is expressively illiberal, focusing on the family, the role of religion in public life, as well as an anti-LGBT agenda too. So this is Orban delivering the keynote to that summit. So we have a much more contested transnational fabric now in terms of what matters. And the clip that we couldn't play was a video clip of Nigel Farage campaigning for Trump in Arizona, saying this is the leader of the only leader in the West who's not a globalist, right? Who is not afraid to sort of call out this kind of global nonsense and support the sovereign state. And that is now a much more popular position on the American right that aligns foreign policy aims more with domestic politics. So I'm going to hand it back over to Dan, who's also going to talk us through about historically this counter-order messaging, and then move us through to conclusion and your questions.
Yeah, when we give this presentation, it's usually people don't have a lot of issues when we argue that, there's a lot more goods provision out there, that there's now competition over client states, that's eroding U.S. power because of the effects of the loss of monopoly, what we call the patronage monopoly, across a lot of ordering goods that are both responsible for giving leverage for ordering, but also produce order. We don't tend to have a lot of pushback on the argument that weaker states are exploiting this, and this is allowing for the emergence of really of alternatives, about allowing for states to partially exit or fully exit from the existing U.S. aspects of hegemonic ordering. But we often have had pushback on all this talk about like transnational right-wing movements and other kinds of counter-order movements, right? I mean, everybody agrees that these are counter-order movements, that they not only kind of call for changes in their domestic governments, but view the international order itself as a threat. People obviously are aware of the degree that some states, particularly Russia, has tried to insert itself as a broker by helping out various kinds of European far-right parties, and tried to do the same thing. And particularly with the NRA and with the U.S. Republican Party. But the question sort of is, how does this matter? And we've actually gotten that question less recently since the attempted insurrection insurrection at the US Capitol, which has sort of convinced some people that right-wing reactionary movements with transnational connections could possibly matter to the hegemon. But we just want to sort of make clear that counterorder movements matter a lot, in that they're one of the things that are most overlooked in discussions of power transitions. For one thing, all of the big revisionist states, like the states we think of as the challengers who brought about major conflicts in the last 100 or so years, all of those states were not, it's not like the government woke up one day and said, we're going to be revisionist. Those governments originated in the development of counterorder movements, usually transnational, both subnational, but usually transnationally linked, as was fascism in the interwar period, as was Bolshevism in the interwar period. And so indeed, the mechanism by which you get your Germanys and Japans is the mechanism of counterorder movements, transnational, often transnational in scope, taking over governments. In my own work, earlier work, I looked at the collapse of Spanish hegemony, or the decline of Spanish hegemony. And what I found there is that story is primarily a story driven by transnational religious contention, international Calvinism, as we would now call it, and the role that had in fermenting insurrections and instability in helping to perpetuate particularly the Dutch revolt, which drained Spain of its military and economic power in Western Europe. And so it was really the transnational religious movements that were opposed to the existing Catholic order that helped to produce major power political shifts in the period. If you think about the biggest, most consequential transformation of the last century or so in international order, it's the collapse of European colonial empires through decolonization. And while by the 1950s, this was in part being driven by US and Soviet competition for loyalty among the new nations, the origins of decolonization are rooted in transnational networks and anti-colonial networks in which people in European colonies were getting together and were sharing ideas and were transmitting ideas about opposition to European imperialism and its illegitimacy. And this really starts this dates, the big sort of uptick in this stuff actually dates to the 1919 or so, in the end of the First World War. And this is driving a lot of, as I said, what I think is the most important transformation of the last centuries. All of these were rooted in counterorder movements. And short of this, as we suggested in the kind of analytical arrow slide, it doesn't, even if counterorder movements don't produce wars, even if they don't take over governments, they still make collective mobilization for power and influence harder. I mean, let's be honest about this. This is why great powers support try to wedge apart domestic political civil society in countries that they want to erode. So if you look at Russian influence operations in the West, highly opportunistic and mostly oriented towards exacerbating existing cleavages, right? Kind of indifferent ultimately to whether these are left-wing or right-wing cleavages. What matters is that they undermine the ability of states that are upholding the order to leverage resources and mobilization in pursuit of maintaining their existing institutions and their existing power capabilities. And this is something that happens across a large number of power transitions. While the mediums change, sometimes it's the printing press, sometimes it's Twitter. These kinds of strategies remain the same, and they do so precisely because collective mobilization by counterorder movements has this effect of weakening the incumbent powers that are trying to uphold order. So we say there are a couple of implications for this. Alex, do you want to come in here, or should I just finish this out? I can't even hear Alex. So what implication is that? So what are the implications? So the basic bottom line we have is that if you thought about all of the stuff we're talking about, virtually all of it is completely independent of Donald Trump or of a particular US president. These are effects of secular changes in the global political economy and in the global distribution of power. So we buy that element of power transition theory, and the way it works out politically is independent of what any president does. Now, it does matter that in our accounting, Trump is part of a transnational counterorder movement, a reactionary one. And that matters in particular because it's not very common that the hegemon itself gets captured by a movement that wants to deconstruct its own order, right? That wants to get rid of the order. And that happened to some degree under Trump. So Biden election does matter because it means that the White House is no longer going to be aiding and abetting counterorder movements. The United States is not going to be going in saying its purpose is to destroy the EU, right? Or supporting those forces that oppose key kind of institutions and norms that have helped carry US power for a while. Biden's clearly going to have more interest in goods provision than the Trump administration did, getting back in the even more in the development game and getting back in various kinds of agencies and activities. And we know that the Biden administration wants to massively ramp up the sort of salience of aid, in part to compete with China. And there will almost certainly be more attention to transnational dimensions of political liberalism, and if which our story is right, these transnational dimensions are in fact help to undergird U.S. power, and they need to be protected to maintain U.S. leverage and influence. And it's not just a matter of soft power. And you'll certainly get that because you won't get the active attempt to undermine it. But this doesn't change any of the underlying pressures or overall operation of any of the mechanisms we talked about, right? Some of these could be arrested, some of these there's political agency at stake, but fundamentally, the patronage monopoly is broken. Fundamentally, counter-order movements are still major players, even if they if they've plateaued out. Fundamentally, weaker states know that they can leverage exit options and are doing so. And that's going to increase the cost for the United States of trying to bid to get back in the position of enjoying the kind of patronage position it had. There are other important things that matter. So if we think about the Biden administration as maybe engaging in order conservation or attempts to reform that help to conserve kind of what there is left of the US-led liberal order, the problem is that even those activities are likely to trigger greater contention. So for example, the United States wants to get serious about tackling counter-order movements. That's going to require doing what the Trump administration did, which is taking sides when the US and its allies are internally divided. And the problem is that the United States is divided by the same cleavages that it would be getting involved with in places like Poland or Hungary or Germany. Other aspects of the agenda, such as anti-corruption, are going to risk domestic international backlash. So we have this sort of we are actually very strongly committed, something we can talk about. We think that a key element to maintaining kind of US ordering is tackling the way that capital mobility has promoted enormous corruption in the way that that's rebounded on US foreign policy making, that money flooding into the US has affected US politics and also US dark money flooding out. The problem is that anti-corruption efforts threaten the stability and the livelihood of a lot of the regimes that right now are kind of unhappy with international order anyway. So even something as apparently non-geopolitically power political as tackling anti-corruption is likely to provoke further challenges and further desires for exit. So our bottom line when we give policy advice, and we just had a piece about this in national interest, is the United States needs to learn to lose. In that one of the big problems the United States confronts is an inability to sort of adjust to an environment in which it's going to be outcompeted in some cases, in which it's not going to be able to sustain the same kind of power asymmetries it's had. And the United States learns to lose some of these battles and learns to pick its battles more wisely, then it's in pretty good shape because it still has the biggest alliance system the world has ever seen. It still has a fairly, an extremely powerful military. It still has a lot of sources of economic vitality. It just doesn't have the kind of overwhelming advantage in ideology, in economic strength, and in increasingly military capabilities that it used to enjoy. And as we've said, that is not coming back. So that's the end, and I will get us out of the screen.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so very much. It was a very rich, extremely rich intellectual discussion. We've been in this conversation for almost 45 minutes now, so that's just for the sake of time and just let the people ask questions, because we've already received a few questions in the direct message. Why don't we give the floor to our colleague, Dr. Igor Istomin, for his view of the issue and your book, and then we'll have it back to you to respond to his comments, and then open for the Q&A. Igor.
Thank you so much. I hope you hear me. I think we are very lucky that the book series starts with a book by Alex and Dan. The research tackles directly the issues which are core for the new center. And I also wish to use this opportunity to congratulate Maxim with its launch and to extend best wishes. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my reflections on the fascinating research, which examines the crucial questions where the world is going, what are the mechanisms which drive its evolution. I think Alex and Dan just presented the argument very eloquent and in a very powerful way. So I try not to repeat them, but let me just suggest a few thoughts on why this book is important and why everyone who hasn't read it thus far should do it immediately after this event. And also, as I was asked to be a discussant, I would also share a couple of questions that I've got while rereading this book again this week. In recent years, we witnessed an emergence of a whole market of literature on American decline and the decay of the liberal order. And quite a number of authors attempted to cover these topics in very various ways and with much uneven success, I would say. So why should the reader choose this book rather than many others that appear on the shelf? I would say that Alex's and Dan's work stands out on several points. First, it provides a clear conceptual picture, which is often absent from the current debates. It defines with great clarity what we mean when we talk about hegemony order and liberal order in particular. I found the distinction, which was not, I think, in the presentation, but which is very prominent in the book, between architecture and infrastructure of the order, especially thought-provoking. And the book also emphasizes a difference between order and hegemony, which is sometimes overlooked, although also speaks about their connection. Second, the book captures a lot of nuances and it avoids many of the common cliches that are often pronounced on the subject. The authors rightly point out that the process of ordering, and this is another very important part of the book, they're speaking about liberal ordering rather than liberal order, and the fact that it is an unfinished business and it was an unfinished business, demonstrate contradictions between principal elements of the architecture of the liberal order, namely liberal democracy, market capitalism, and institutionalism. Third, and I think this is what we had an opportunity to experience right now, the book covers an enormous amount of empirical record. And I would say that the examples that we heard is just a tip of the iceberg that we find in the book. It's an unbelievable work of systematizing great information of various kinds to substantiate their argument, and a very thorough analysis of evidence related to the recent developments throughout the last 3 decades. The authors contribute some interesting examples on Russian foreign policy, which I would say rarely even mentioned in the scholarly and expert community here in Moscow. So I think it is also a useful book from the point of what we call in Russian народное просвещение, public enlightenment. There are, however, aspects of the book that left me with certain doubts, and as any thought-provoking piece, this volume encouraged to ask many questions, but in the interest of time, allow me to focus on 3 broad points. First, let me point on the position of the book in the scholarship. So on several occasions, and especially in chapter 3, Alex and Dan strive to distinguish themselves from the power transition argument. They explicitly mention in this regard Robert Gilpin and Charles Kindleberger. And the book also delineates 3 pathways of change, including great power challenges, challenges from below, and transnational contestation kind of challenges from within. I frankly believe that putting the demand for order from below in the spotlight and the discussion of the competition among providers of common, club, and private goods are among the most interesting theoretical propositions in the book. However, I'm not sure that they belong to the core of the explanation answering the question that they ask in the beginning, because they ask whether the American hegemony is unraveling and whether it can come back, or it's just another cycle and it will be a temporary cycle. In fact, the argument, rather than becoming a counter to power transition literature, broadly fits within its logic. It basically presents to us a more sophisticated and refined picture of power transition than the crude theory of Gilpin or Argansky. And by the way, they also specifically emphasize that they do not agree with Gilpin that war is inevitable, but I have to say that Argansky also doesn't think that war is a necessary precondition for the power transition. So the three pathways of change indicated in the book point merely to intermediate rather than independent variables in explaining the demise of hegemony. They demonstrate the transmission belts of the unraveling of the order rather than core things that in the center. The ultimate difference between the 1990s and today lies in the decline of the American power and the reduction of the gap between the US and other powers. Why do I think that this is problematic for the argument? Well, basically because the book says virtually nothing on power transition itself. And I have to say that in the presentation, we saw this very interesting graphs and charts of changing, GDP or changing military power, but there are no such graphs within the book itself. Alex and Dan takes this transition as a given. They do not provide their own theory of what is power and how it could be measured. Neither conduct a systematic comparison between the United States, China, and Russia on their capabilities. As the book conclusion demonstrates, the authors remain agnostic on the question, where do we go in terms of the power transition trends? They remain open both to a new bipolarity, for example, or to the potential of multipolar order. These are all scenarios which are presented in the conclusion. Nevertheless, they claim, and this is an important claim in the book, that infrastructure of international order contributes to the power of the hegemon. And here we have to take their word for granted because we are not presented with measures of power and of this contribution to the power from the order. And this brings me to the absolutely heretic question from the point of the Russian scholar. For example, how could we really be sure that the US power indeed declined and will continue to do so in the future? How could we verify that Moscow is in a better position vis-a-vis Washington in comparison to the 1990s and especially in 2000s? Because if it is not, then the pathways of change described in the book will remain closed because there is no power transition. Could we accept contribution of international order to American power as Alex and Dan suggest? Or should we follow some other scholars like Christopher Lane and Barry Posen, who claim that all these alliances and bases drain American power rather than contribute to it? So these are the questions that I got after reading this book. Second major point, I think, and broad point, is that the book juggles with two very important notions, which are both in the title. It's the hegemony and the order. And the question is how they are connected, and it's not often clear from the book where we are speaking about the demise of the hegemony and where do we speak about the problems with the order, and specifically with the liberal order. The book initially provides a very hard-headed discussion of the term. The authors even recognize that there is no single order rather than a historically contingent combination of norms, rules, and patterns of interaction that support them. However, they accept established designation of liberal order as a matter of compromise with the scholarly mainstream. As it was mentioned earlier, one of the most innovative aspects of the book is delineation of architecture from infrastructure of the order. And architecture is basically norms and rules, and infrastructure is all kinds of things that support these norms and rules, patterns of interaction and practices. So the authors identify three elements of the architecture of liberal order, namely political liberal governance within states, commitment to open economic exchanges, and intergovernmentalism, by which the authors mean peaceful diplomatic interaction between states, primarily through multilateral, but also bilateral agreements and organizations. And from my perspective, intergovernmentalism remains a marquee point because it basically could cover any kind of non-coercive interaction among states. It is not clear what is so liberal about intergovernmentalism. But when we look at the empirical part of the book, we see the authors are more interested in the infrastructure of the international order rather than in its architecture. There are kind of more about this infrastructure, even if it's not very clear what is specifically liberal in the infrastructure. Alex and Dan, for example, recognize that alliances, forward deployments, and treaties are not necessarily used by the liberal hegemons, that similar infrastructure was employed by the Soviet Union, for example, and is currently applied by Russia and China. It seems that the so-called infrastructure has more to do with the hegemony than with the order. Early in the book, Alex and Dan recognize that disagreements with the ruling hegemon do not necessarily represent an assault on the order. However, in the empirical part, they universally treat them as such. For example, a lot is written in the book about multilateral organizations and clubs that Russia and China champion. Let's remember that multilateralism was proclaimed as part of the liberal order. However, Russia and China-led organizations are often treated in the book as challenge to both American hegemony and liberalism. When you read the text, you come to the conclusion, at least I came to the conclusion, that virtually everything that Russia and China do, especially if the United States is not around, automatically becomes a challenge not only to the hegemony, but also to the international norms. Here, I would disagree with the reading by the authors of Russian and Chinese policies towards the liberal order. Of the three elements that they identify, three elements of architecture, Moscow and Beijing clearly disagree only with the first one regarding the primacy of liberal democracy as the only legitimate regime. But this was, from the very start, the weakest of the three pillars, which never acquired universal recognition. It is where liberal ordering advanced the least in the first place. Meanwhile, neither Russia nor China object against global economy based on market capitalism. That is why in a very extensive debate of the Russian and Chinese record, so little is said about their challenge of economic freedom. If anyone, it seems the United States are the most unhappy about the current norms in the global economy, and it is Washington, which was already under Obama, strived to replace the notion of free trade with the notion of fair trade. So, by the way, that is what was at the core of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an attempt to revise norms of global trade. Russia and China certainly no less than the United States committed to work through multilateral organizations and treaties. I would claim that multilateralism and institutionalism are the areas where Washington's record is the poorest in terms of the three pillars, especially under Republican administrations. And actually, the book illustrates this quite well. So it would be fair to say that Russia and China challenged the American hegemony, but as for the order, in the way it is defined by Alex and Dan, they disagree only with one specific aspect of it. And more broadly, I would even claim that Russia currently is more a conservative force in terms of international institutions, that it kind of more is afraid of change rather than act as a revolutionary and even reformist power in terms of the institutions. Finally, I must admit that the book has an amazing cover, which shows Mr. Trump from the back and waving American flag. And in the book itself, the one whole chapter is devoted almost exclusively to Trump's administration. Of course, Alex and Dan are quite critical about his policies, claiming that they contributed to the unraveling of the liberal order and the American hegemony. Obviously, I am not in the best position to enter the domestic American debate on the subject. Nevertheless, while looking at the Trump's rhetoric, we cannot avoid examining his actual policies. The book, for example, pushes back on Trump's claims regarding American alliances. But if we look at NATO in the last 4 years, we see more defense spending by its European members and more American troops in Europe. Therefore, if we go beyond rhetoric to actual deeds, it is not clear that this alliance somehow devolved in the last 4 years. If you look in Asia, Asia-Pacific, or Indo-Pacific, as the US now says, Trump invested heavily in solidifying US alliances in Asia through so-called Quad. He also improved the relations with Israel. So I would say that his record on this alliance thing is very kind of is not universally one-sided. And while Trump himself did not address the matter of liberal democracy that often, his administration used quite heavily ideological rhetoric, especially in relations with Russia and China. On both occasions, it presented relations with these countries as a struggle between freedom and autocracies. We also witnessed repeated American sanctions justified in terms of human rights and political freedoms. So, I mean, once again, as looking from the outside, looking maybe from the position of challenge, it doesn't seem that there's such a great difference as it was presented in the book. To be fair, Alex and Dan do not deny that preceding American record of liberal ordering was far from perfect. However, they claim that under Trump, we see differences in quantity of deviations and difference in conditions under which they occur. They claim that Trump's policies undermine not just liberal order, but American hegemony itself. For the outsiders, it seems that the US is currently torn between two alternative perspectives. The first believes that it is necessary to sacrifice part of the liberal order to keep and revitalize American hegemony. This is the camp in which Trump falls. The second perspective claims that such departure from preceding norms and institutions will only expedite American decline. And it seems that Alex and Dan are clearly on the side of the second perspective, as the Biden administration, if you look at the document which appeared the other day. Only the time will tell whether they are right or wrong, but it seems to me very unlikely that even the new Biden administration will avoid the tendency to seek further revisions in existing norms and institutions. Perhaps it will continue to do such revisions under the banner and in the name of the liberal order, but it will also require reinterpretation of what it means by liberalism. Anyway, I'm sorry that it took me so much time to enlist my points. Such a great book inspires to think deeper and to ask more questions. And I believe now Alex and Dan will be able to demonstrate how and where I am wrong in my assessments and interpretations of their argument. But I just want to reiterate that I'm sure this is a must-read book, as it is devoted to such an important topic, delivers an original argument, and contains a sophisticated analysis. And I think that it is a especially useful book for students, as it is written very clearly. It is rather concise, which students like. And most importantly for the younger audience, it includes a lot of nice pictures. So thank you.
Igor, thanks so much for those really kind words and also the great comments. I would suggest, just because time is running low, we have some ideas how to respond, but maybe we can bundle them in with some of our answers to the questions, because I would like to try and answer everyone's questions, if that's okay.
Sure. We got a lot of questions, actually. Most of them are going to our direct messaging of the Institute and myself. So we've got 10 so far, but I tried to group them into kind of three major categories. One, the first question we had, actually a very practical one. Can you elaborate a little bit on the discussion about foreign policy in the United States, meaning to what extent, in your views, there is an understanding of the exit from hegemony in the US national security community? And do you think that the new progressive foreign policy movement is, in a way, a response to this situation? You want to jump on this and then kind of together with what Igor asked?
I think you should take that, given that you've been ensconced in some of these progressive foreign policy debates. So.
I'm actually pretty cynical about this. I think that U.S. foreign policy positions are relatively inelastic with respect to trends in U.S. power, right? Essentially, what we get is we get the same arguments repackaged to fit context. So the example I like to give is that in the 1990s, the Project for New American Century was saying that the United States needed ginormous defense budgets in order to maintain hegemony forever. Those arguments, of course, were put into place in the 2000s. But now we need the same ginormous defense budgets in order to compete with great power competitors, right? So it doesn't seem to matter whether the United States is on top or is entering a multipolar world. We still need the same policies. In the same way, I think progressives would be committed to anti-kleptocracy policy abroad and at home, and would be committed to big investments in infrastructure big investments in sort of the engines of American power, regardless of whether or not we thought the United States was trying to conserve a dominant position or whether the United States was in a competitive environment. Now, it is true that there's been an upswing in, there have been some, it is true there have been some changes, right? So there's definitely been an upswing in the kind of restraint movement, and which I think is in part driven by the fact of U.S. limitations, I think, play into that. But I think more concretely than sort of competition with China or Russian reassertiveness, I think what's it's Iraq and Afghanistan and the so-called forever wars that are driving a lot of that sort of shift. And that's also part of the reason why Trump was able to win election and get the nomination and win election, criticizing the prior Republican president's foreign policies. So I do think they're relatively inelastic. I do think that definitely there is a heightened awareness of U.S. limitations, or of the fact that the United States is in an environment where other countries are not following its policies as much as they might once have. I think there's intense awareness, anxiety, I think over anxiety to some degree about the rise of China. And that's the dominant feature of US foreign policy right now. But yeah, I think it's an interesting stew. We could give an entire presentation on it, which wouldn't do it justice. But I do think that we have to keep in mind that mostly people's foreign policy positions are relatively fixed, and their rationales are being updated with respect to these developments more than I think these developments are driving U.S. foreign policy, which isn't. Yeah.
And let me just weigh in just a couple of sentences that addresses Igor's very good point about, well, where's the change here? Isn't it just the norms? Russia and China back intergovernmentalism, multilateralism. I think part of the point of the book is to show 1990s that there was what Tom Wright has called this convergence wager, right? The idea that these three pillars would mutually reinforce and mutually constitute each other, right? And so economic openness, democracy, multilateralism when it was convenient, would translate into supporting the liberal international economic order. Dan and I have a new piece coming out in Foreign Affairs online on where we argue the world is much more illiberal now than we think in the US. And part of that is because these institutions, these architectures that we in the 1990s and early 2000s, we were accustomed as thinking of preserving liberalism, are actually neutral or in contesting mode now. And so part of the problem with what Dan talks about, that the playbook hasn't changed, is by reinforcing a lot of these same types of policies, you're actually not confronting order contestation. You are preserving what is a system that is transforming. And I would argue transforming quite rapidly in terms of the purpose and the types of connections being made. And if you think of the ecological metaphor, the kind of non-liberal part of the ecosystem, right? So I think there's a couple problems there. Just because we call something the UN or a regional organization or a new kind of governance over an issue like the internet doesn't necessarily mean that it's following the same playbook as before. And I think that's also a big gap there. So yeah, let's go on to other questions.
Sure. So we have actually one question that pierces through a number of interests a lot of people here. So basically, the debate that the American power is declining is going to be replaced by a new multipolar or non-polar polycentric order has been going on for decades. So if predictions that the United States predictions of the United States fall in the 1990s didn't come through because of the problems of its competitors, right? As you mentioned, Japan and the USSR, and the productivity boost in the US due to some technological advance. So the question is, can something similar happen today in your view? And that would, if not undermine, then perhaps slow the exit. And then another question, I thought it's kind of similar to this one, is what are the possible transition scenarios of transformation of the world order, and whether you see China as a potential hegemon in the future? And if yes, what does China need to do to attain this hegemony in your view?
Let me address G2. Maybe Dan can talk about transition. I mean, I think, look, we're very skeptical in the book about the G2 world based on the Cold War paradigm. And that's part because the world is much more interconnected now than it was during the Cold War. And so what you see with China, you know, is influence, but in certain spheres, right? You don't see a Chinese world the way you saw a Soviet bloc, right? For instance, in the same way, concrete way. In fact, China's biggest military base abroad also hosts, you know, a dozen other countries, or close to it, maybe 8 other countries, and that's the facility at Djibouti. So these kind of classical metrics don't help us. But I do think that, you know, the name of the game in this sort of polycentric world is hedging, right? If you are a state, you want to hedge as much as you can. You want to drive up your leverage in bargaining power with as many countries as you can, right? And so this is where Dan and I sort of make the argument in terms of, can it be reconstituted? Not unless you want to take each one of these dyads and spend a whole lot of money and a whole lot of treasure to sort of outbid your competitors. And that's just foolish and it's unrealistic. So in that national interest piece, we take issue with the fact that we just got involved in Ecuador buying off their debt to China in exchange for them not moving on the 5G standard. Because to us, this is kind of, you know, kind of lunacy. You know, we're going to go chase every country that China and Russia have shown an interest in, right? This kind of mode of great power thinking isn't really strategic. It's just reactive. So I think in terms of what replaces it, it doesn't necessarily have to be a new hegemon. And a polycentric world can still be an asymmetrical and a hierarchical world, especially in different regions. You know, my own pet peeve is when I hear this trope that Russia is declining, China is rising, as if somehow that that tells us anything about, you know, sort of strategic choices that have to be made. But Dan's point that we have to learn how to lose, that we have to formulate in a more independent manner what it is our interests are and what we want to defend, is a really important one. Otherwise, you know, Tajikistan, Sudan, Ecuador, all of these places, we're going to turn our attention to. Why? Because Moscow and Beijing are engaged there? It doesn't make much sense to us.
On something that Alex said, something that makes me crazy is that the same people who want to emphasize the rise of the China threat and focus on PPP, PPP GDP, right, purchasing power parity, where China has overtaken the United States. When they turn around and they look at Russia, they move to nominal and they say, well, look at how weak China is. Well, I mean, how weak Russia is. But in purchasing power parity terms, Russia's economy is equivalent to Germany's, right? And so, you know, there is this kind of obsession in the United States with the idea that Russia's in terminal decline, and Russia doesn't need to be, you know, a rising the way China is. All it needs to do is be back at its sort of normal historical point of being an important great power for it to be able to contest U.S. influence, as we've seen. In terms of the sort of questions of transition, I think this loops back into some really astute points that commentator made about liberal order. So, and it also lifts back into a way that I was a bit flip about U.S. foreign policy, right? There clearly is a major, the emergence of Trumpism is a major change in some aspects of U.S. foreign policy, in particular, the rejection of certain foundational values that have guided U.S. foreign policy, at least rhetorically, if often not in practice. And that is sort of the notion that the United States ought to completely reconceptualize the balance between sovereignty and individual rights, that it ought to reconceptualize the basis of human rights, put them on much more a natural law foundation. And this is a reaction against kind of LGBTQ rights and things like that. And then finally, the sort of the more kind of transactionalist, et cetera, approach to international relations, and the complete sort of de-emphasis on multilateralism, plus the idea that certain kinds of institutional features like the EU, the US promoted as seeing as sort of distributing responsibilities and handling perennial strategic problems in Western Eurasia, these are competitors. The reason I raise this is that what we're seeing in international order is not, of course it's not, and I think this point was really powerful, it's true, is not like the end of quote unquote big L liberal order, right? What we're seeing is we're seeing a mutation, a transformation in liberal order in which certain aspects of liberal order are becoming more important than other ones. So one of the things we point out in the book is that there's always a trade-off between the liberal intergovernmentalist commitment to multilateralism at a maximum and sovereign equality at the minimum, and the political liberal and economic liberal commitments to how domestic economies and civil society and institutions are organized, right? So, the more you prioritize the idea that countries should have some amount of liberal rights in their domestic architecture, the more you are eroding the sovereignty norm, right? This is something that Russia, China, a lot of states, Turkey are acutely aware of. So what's happening is not that liberal intergovernmentalism is going away. It's actually becoming stronger, but it's becoming stronger at the expense of political liberalism, right? This is happening both in incumbent institutions like the United Nations, but it's also a feature of the new institutions that China and to a lesser degree Russia are building, which adopt liberal intergovernmentalism, but they don't adopt the politically liberal values. In fact, the SCO is actively opposed to them. And so you're seeing a mutation there where order is shifting in some ways, which is a lot better for a lot of countries in the world if they care about their sovereignty and they care about autonomy, and they don't want to have certain kinds of rights regimes imposed on them. It's moving more towards this other paradigm globally. In the same way, economic liberalism is mutated, right? We went from the Bretton Woods system to the Washington Consensus to, I think, what we call kind of the globalized kleptocratic oligarchic version of the Washington Consensus, where capital mobility and other types of economic arrangements kind of outpaced regulatory environments. Right. And I think there, the rise of China is really interesting, and Russia as well, and their increasing influence, because there you have a lot of commonality of interests with, say, multipolar populists, right? Essentially towards an economic order which still allows for trade, which still allows for capital mobility, but really privileges domestic patronage networks, right, in the economy. And there, for example, this is one of the things where Trumpism was really headed in the United States, was towards a more patronized, more distribution of private goods, things that people in a lot of other countries recognize, right, as a basis of economy. So what that means is that the transition is probably not going to look, as Alex has said, like a collapse of the order. It's not going to probably look, short of a great power war, it's not going to look like, sort of the old style version of multipolarity. What it's going to look like is this differently ordered versions of liberalism, which have effects on the United States domestically, right? And have effects on US power as well. If you think that certain kinds of these arrangements tended to be lubricants for U.S. influence rather than, getting in the way of U.S. influences, some of the Trump brand strategy thinkers thought. What are the big debates now? And I'm saying this because I think it answers a bunch of questions that people have raised in terms of transition. When you talk about things like great power competition, or you talk about where the U.S. ought to be fighting, or you talk about the U.S. use of sanctions, the big question we have right now is the U.S. clearly has a massive, still, infrastructure advantage, right, in institutional strength, institutional networks, in military and economic terms, on the financial side, on the security provision side. We know that a part of the reason that is sustained is what people like Will Weinkauf and others have argued is because of preferential attachment, right? As long as the U.S. network gives you lots of lower transaction costs and advantages, even if it imposes costs, you're not going to move away from it, right? So you remain in SWIFT, even though it means you're vulnerable to sanctions, because you have to invest a ton of resources in building an alternative mechanism. And even then, you need a lot of countries to be in it for it to be really effective, right? So the question is, what is the threshold where those dynamics start to shift, where the costs of remaining in those institutions, this infrastructure gets too high to bear even more, to bear, and where you build enough nodes in your network, right? You build enough nodes in the Chinese BRI, infrastructure development, multilateral fora, that network starts to become really advantageous to join. Right, and that's the debate in U.S. foreign policy. The hardliners, the new Cold Warriors, say that it's just around the corner, and the U.S. has to fight everywhere. Right. We think it's sort of unknowable, but the U.S. has a lot more slack. If what the U.S. cares about is maintaining its security and its core alliances in East Asia and in Europe, and cares about maintaining some amount of dollar hegemony, then it has more slack, and it has to focus less on kind of competing everywhere and more on reducing the costs that states have to bear by being in that infrastructure, which means, for example, wiser use of sanctions regimes. Right.
Guys, can I just quickly, I know we're running out of time. We got a minute and a half, actually. There's one important question on the very book that I can't help but asking, and one thing that many other participants asked that I personally think is incredibly important. So the short question is, so in your book you mentioned wedging and brokerage strategies, which in your view dominate in bringing about and kind of underpinning contemporary liberal world order? That's one question on the book. And the second one, really short. So this week the Biden administration released the interim national security strategy guidance, and there is so much focus on average Americans there. So the needs of the middle class and the apparent urgency to bridge the divide between the foreign policy elites and common people. So the question is, what do you see in this? Is this an attempt to quote unquote exit hegemony, or on the contrary to strengthen it, or it is quote unquote a facelift for the old hegemonic policies? How do you see that? And we'll end on these two.
Well, let me take the first part of that. I think we see both, right? But I think what's really important about wedging strategies is that you saw the Trump administration itself have a big old wedge, right? That it started to sort of again, in other words, right-wing governments are always skeptical of multilateralism. They're not skeptical of the alliance system. And so what we saw with the Trump support for Brexit, right, the weakening of the EU, right, was this ultra transactionalism, this idea that if you just strip out all architectures and infrastructures, reduce all relationships to naked power, the US will triumph, right? So they didn't actually believe in the concept of architecture and infrastructure, right, as being a power source. To me, that's incredibly important. It's not just actions by the Kremlin or Beijing trying to drive divisions. This is the stuff what international politics is about. It's that we took a sledgehammer to many of our own pillars of our own order and our own power and started unraveling them, right? I think that's the important part. At the same time, the rise of these other forms of regional organizations, other types of norms, other connections, is building an alternative universe. And we can talk about how effective it is. We can compare it in terms of metrics. But again, in the ecological system, it's just a lot more crowded in areas of the world than it used to be when it was just the US-led institutions in town. And I'll let Dan finish with the competitiveness point and middle class point.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a focus of, there have been a number of people pushing this on the left in progressive thought and then in center left thought, this idea that the United States needs to spend less time selling, US foreign policy needs to spend less time selling what they're up to the American public and more time putting the American public's interests and views first and letting that process, reversing that process, essentially, instead of trying to convince everybody that foreign policy technocrats are right, listening to what people actually want. And I think that the NSS represents the interim guidance, that kind of stuff, that represents the ascendancy of this idea. In practice, though, we'll see, whether that translates into anything. It is very, very difficult to turn, one of the things about being a really powerful actor with a global network is that creates a lot of inertia, which is a lot of the reason why Trump was not able to change the course of a lot of the ship of state in a lot of areas. It's the infrastructure of US hegemony is designed that way. It's designed to make it hard to make major alterations, right? It's designed to create interdependencies, which is a source of US strength, but it's also a source of US constraint. So yeah, that's certainly the way that people want to talk about it. And I think it's a good idea. I mean, I think that, you know, you can only lecture at Americans so much about like why what you're doing is in their interest. It's, you know, you can always, at some level you have to sort of build foreign policy, or at least build the way you think about foreign policy in terms of those kind of bread and butter concerns. But I don't know, you know, I guess I think that I am skeptical that that's going to, I guess, skeptical that that's going to, the only place where I see that really happening, I guess, is on the trade front. You know, I think that ultimately the US is going to, ultimately this is probably going to be more a shift in the way we talk about foreign policy if it holds than the way we practice foreign policy. Yeah. And I think that that gets to these questions about, you know, will the US kind of really recognize its relative weakness? Will the US, you know, move to accommodate other states? You know, I just, you know, I think that, you know, I think it's just very difficult for the United States to change some of its basic habits of thought about the world. And when it does try to do that, when you have, it's generally been ways that are, you know, I think are actually destructive, like, so the sort of Trump way of doing things, so.
Okay, Igor, you want to add or subtract anything to what's been said? No?
Well, I just want to say the questions are awesome, and I wish we could get to them. And I also want to say that
sure, there are tons of them over there that I just didn't have time to ask.
If you can send me the text log, I can try to, you know, sort of answer them on our website or something. I also want to say that the questions are super incisive, and like all of the weaknesses in the book got nailed, right? So like it's the, oh my gosh, right? You're right. And we were hoping people didn't notice that. It is very difficult. And I will say it's very difficult. So one of the things that Americans aren't good at doing, and we fall into this, is it's very hard to distinguish between the order and US hegemony, this habit of thought that they are inseparable, right? And this is why I think it's right to say we didn't emphasize this issue of infrastructure, because for us, it's the sort of daily practices that are embedded in a lot of liberal order, but not all of it, of US hegemony that give the US so much influence, right? And this is why we think changes in norms and changes in sort of even practices, the rise of new infrastructures, which are shifts in liberalism, not necessarily the end of liberalism, can be consequential for US power and influence. And our being.
Guys, thank you so very much for your time to spend your Friday morning for those of you in the United States, and Friday evening for those of you sitting here in Moscow with us.
That's a great sacrifice. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a great delight to have you, and those of you following us online, please stay with us for our next edition and next series. We'll be hosting another book in April. It will most likely be on climate change and how it affects states and how it affects bilateral agenda in US-Russia relations. So stay tuned. Follow the YouTube channel of the ИМИ МГИМО and our Telegram channel, Post America. So thanks for being with us, and thank you for your questions, and thank you so much for our support team. It wouldn't have been possible, this event, without the great assistance by Nikita Lipunov and Adlan Margoyev. So thank you so much, and see you next month, probably.
Thanks so much for having us. Have a great week.
Thank you.